Such a story and all the day-by-day revelations that go with it are unfolding against a backdrop that our next guest pays a lot of attention to. New York Times columnist Tom Friedman likes to look at the grand sweep of history, backdrop and all. He's the New York Times best-selling author of Thank You for Being Late, and it's always good to have him on the broadcast. Tom, what do you make of the story of Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, Paul Manafort meeting with this Russian lawyer, and obviously the story that Donald Trump Jr. has told now has shifted?
Well, you know, I think there's the big message for me in that story, Anderson, is that from the very beginning, the Russians have tried to impact this election. And they try to do it through a number of ways, obviously in sending a probe to the Trump campaign, and more specifically, as our intelligence agencies have reported, by actually hacking the email of the Democratic National Committee and John Podesta. Why did they do that? I think for two reasons, and one was revealed in the Trump meeting. They are under sanctions because of their invasion of Ukraine and seizure of Crimea, and they wanted to get those sanctions lifted, and they believed they would have a much better chance of that happening if Donald Trump were president. And number two, Putin wants to fracture the West. And he believed, I think rightly, if Donald Trump were president, he would be a chaos candidate. And he would no longer be able to lead the Western alliance in a coherent way around Russia. And therefore, they wanted to tilt the election his way. And I would say that was a pretty good bet. Well, you know, when you think about it, Anderson, just say one other thing, that for less than the cost of a MiG-29 fighter jet, look what Putin bought.
The president talking about sort of aligning with Russia on some sort of cyber initiative, and then now clearly backtracking from that because the reaction to it has been, you know, understandably people saying it's ludicrous. Does it surprise you that the president at this stage would suggest something like that?
Well, you know, I think that really Senator Lindsey Graham got it best. If that isn't the dumbest idea that I've ever heard of, it's surely right up there in the top three. And the notion that the President of the United States would talk about collaborating on a kind of somehow cybersecurity unit with a country that just hacked our democratic election, which you know, uses secret agents to poke poison umbrellas into people, which in its own country does not operate free and fair elections. Just even mentioning it in anything other than a joking way is ridiculous, and really leads you to question once again the judgment of the President of the United States.
You've written in the past, recently in the past, about the president. I think at one point, I'm not sure if the term was pathological liar, but you pointed out a number of the inconsistencies that have come from this president. Just, you know, one of the things that came out of this meeting with Putin, Secretary of State Tillerson on Friday says sanctions had come up in the conversation. Then you have the president tweeting yesterday that sanctions were not discussed in the conversation. Then this afternoon, Sarah Huckabee Sanders contradicted the president, saying sanctions did come up.
You know, it would be funny if it weren't about our own country, Anderson. You know, the president, I don't know what to say. I'm not a doctor, but he doesn't behave as an adult, let alone as a president. And this kind of loose back and forth about what happened in a meeting, there are evidently no note takers. There was just Tillerson and the Russian foreign minister and two translators. And so here we had a meeting between two world leaders, an extremely important meeting, and even the American side can't agree what happened.
You know, one of the things you said recently in a column really has stuck in my mind, and it sort of relates to this because I think people now on different sides of the aisle or different parts of the country, you know, have different truths. And one of the things you wrote, you said sectarianism that has destroyed nation states in the Middle East is now infecting us, comparing it essentially Democrats versus Republicans to Sunni versus Shia. I mean, that's a terrifying prospect.
It is a terrifying prospect if you lived as I did through the Lebanese Civil War. But that is what's happening. You know, you hear people literally saying, I wouldn't want my kids to marry one of them. And the them they're referring to is not someone of a different race or religion, bad enough. But now it's of a different party. In Washington, you hear people say, well, I hope none of them, you know, are going to be at the meeting or the dinner or the conference. And what's so terrifying about it is that, you know, it's the doing we do together, Anderson, that matters most. We have so many big, hard challenges before us: infrastructure, taxes, education, healthcare. And these are big, hard problems, and big, hard problems can only be done together. And right now, we are simply incapable of doing anything together. Let's think of healthcare. What would a rational Donald Trump have done. Had he come in, we would have come into office and said to Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader, you know, Chuck, you send your top 3 healthcare experts up to Camp David. I'll send my top 3. We'll tell them they can't come down until they forge a compromise. They'll come down. We'll announce it together. I'll get more credit because I'll out-tweet you, and the country will be better off. The notion that Republicans on their own are going to come up with a solution of this problem, a good solution, a rational solution, not just a win for the president, is ludicrous.
You know,
but that's how we're facing every problem.
I had General Michael Hayden on probably a couple of months ago now. One of the things he said has also stuck with me, which is that he talked about the thin veneer of civilization and how we like to think it's sort of set in stone, but that it's really not. It really is this thin veneer. It really is that fragile. Do you see it as fragile?
Oh, absolutely. And if you've lived in the Middle East, as I did for nearly a decade, you really see how fragile it is. We talked in the past once. I quoted a friend of mine from Zimbabwe who said, you Americans kick around this country like it's a football. But it's actually not a football. It's a Fabergé egg. You could actually drop it. You could break it. And right now, we're really just kicking around our country. And the thing that people have to remember is that we are the world. I don't say that in a jingoistic way, but I say that in the sense that we have led the world on a sort of a more integrated global order, rules-based, since the end of World War II. It's had its imperfections, it's had its ups and downs, but all in all, it's really been a period of great peace and prosperity for many Americans and many around the world. You take us out of the equation. You make us a greedy, selfish, American first nation, and your kids won't just grow up in a different America. They'll grow up in a fundamentally different world. A world ordered by Russia or China, or most likely nobody at all. And that will not be a friendly place for America or American prosperity.
And talking about China, I mean, you wrote recently about the U.S. pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And one of the things you said about the Chinese is that essentially they've taken the temperature of Donald Trump, and that for all the talk about him being a great negotiator and a tough guy, I mean, you say, and you've just been traveling throughout Asia, is that Trump basically now has a nickname Chump in China?
Yeah, well, I think that's my nickname for him, because I think if you look at how Bibi manipulated him in Israel, how Putin just manipulated him at the G20, how the Chinese have played him, he's a chump. And the reason he's a chump is because he doesn't do his homework. He hasn't thought things through. Let's look at TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. What was that? That was a 12-nation free trade zone that was created by the United States based on our values and our interests. It had more protections for workers and environment. It was negotiated by Obama, a liberal, than any trade agreement in history. It was what Hillary Clinton said about it, the gold standard of trade agreements, when she was for it before she was against it. Now think about this, Anderson. That trade agreement involved 40% of the global global GDP, 40% of the world economy. We would have been at the head of it. And the real story of TPP, Anderson, is we fleeced everybody. You know why we fleeced everybody? Because they wanted to give us concessions. And why did all these Asian Pacific countries want to give us concessions? Because they didn't want to be left alone with China. We got rid of 18,000 tariffs or would-be tariffs on American goods. So imagine Trump. He could have been sitting down negotiating with Xi Jinping today and said, let me introduce you to my 11 trading partners in a free trade zone right all around your border that we control 40% of the economy. Imagine the leverage we have. Instead, he threw it out the first day in office, I'm sure without reading it, having been properly briefed on it, knowing anything about it. And now we're trying to basically negotiate with the Chinese on Korea and on trade without that leverage. People don't understand, Anderson. Our getting out of TPP was our Brexit. It was our Brexit from the Asian free trade zone. It will have vast consequences, more geopolitical than geoeconomic.
Thomas Friedman, it's good to talk to you. Thank you.
You too.
Much more now on tonight's breaking news. Donald Trump Jr.'s revelation that he met last year with a Russian lawyer promising dirt on Hillary Clinton. There's that, and there's Donald Trump Jr.'s changing story about it. There's also repercussions. More on all of it now from our Jeff Zellum.
The White House faces a new round of questions tonight over potential collusion between the Trump campaign and Russians during last year's election. Fresh off President Trump's meeting with Vladimir Putin, it is another meeting in June of 2016 between Donald Trump Jr. and a Russian lawyer that's drawing fresh scrutiny. The Russian lawyer, known for her opposition to U.S. sanctions against Russia over human rights, said she had damaging information about Hillary Clinton. The White House on the defensive again, insisting President Trump didn't know about the session in Trump Tower that came only 2 weeks after he clinched the Republican nomination. White House spokeswoman Sarah Huckabee Sanders said the president only learned about it in the last few days.
I would certainly say Don Jr. did not collude with anybody to influence the election. Our position is that no one within the Trump campaign colluded in order to influence the election.
But the meeting, first reported by the New York Times, is the first acknowledgement people in Trump's inner circle were willing to consider help from Russians. The question of whether they accepted any is the subject of a special counsel's investigation and inquiries on Capitol Hill. The president's oldest son said he, Jared Kushner, and campaign chairman Paul Manafort agreed to meet with the Russian lawyer to hear what she was offering up about the Clinton campaign. It turned out to be nothing, Trump said, telling CNN her statements were vague, ambiguous, and made no sense. The meeting was arranged by Rob Goldstone, a publicist for a Russian pop singer who worked with President Trump on the Miss Universe pageant, hosted in Moscow in 2013. Trump's also seen in this music video.
What's wrong with you, Emin? Emin, let's get